King David, a man after God's own heart, faced an incredibly challenging day in his life when he returned to Ziklag to find his children and wives taken captive, his possessions burned, and his 600 loyal soldiers devastated. David was heartbroken and angry. He wept and wailed until he had no more tears left to cry. He felt like a failure as a husband, father, and leader. He wondered if God had abandoned him. He lost everything he had in one big swoop. We're going to look at how he responded to such a dark day, but before we do that, let's start from the beginning. David had come a long way since the time he was anointed by the Lord at around the age of 15. He had become a hero among his people after killing Goliath, but the king, Saul, grew jealous of him and has been chasing him ever since. For most of his life, David was considered the chosen one, and everyone knew it, even the king. But now, at around 29 years old, David was living in the wilderness with a band of misfits, his family, and a few other stragglers. They eked out a meager existence by engaging in various forms of labor. It was generally an uncomfortable life. David ran from Saul for so long that he said, maybe if I go over and hide among the Philistines, Saul won't come after me, and surprisingly, that worked as Saul stopped persecuting him for a bit. But that was a David that was so demoralized that he gave up and went to the main enemy of Israel at the time, the Philistines, and started working as a mercenary for the enemy. He was loyal and did their dirty work, but it was not honorable by any measure. Despite his difficult circumstances, the Lord did not abandon David, but it was clear that it didn't feel thrilling to be in that place. He was disrespected right and left by people like Nabal, who perfectly summarized how some people felt about this anointed and loyal man the Lord called a man after God's heart. Nabal refused to help David and his men, even though David had protected Nabal's shepherds and flocks from harm. In response, David was ready to attack Nabal and his household, but Nabal's wife, Abigail, intervened and calmed David down by bringing him and his men food and supplies. David spared Nabal's household because of Abigail's intervention, but Nabal later died, and David took Abigail as his wife. His life and path didn't really reflect that of a chosen one, but he remained faithful to the Lord and did his best to do what was right. With all of this as a backdrop is where David finds himself at Ziklag, nearly 30 years old. The Philistines, seeing an opportunity to exploit the internal divisions within the Israelite kingdom, decided to ally with David and his men and offered to let them fight alongside the Philistine army. Saul, meanwhile, was facing mounting pressure from the Philistines, who were growing increasingly bold and aggressive in their attacks on Israelite settlements. Saul decided to take matters into his own hands and led the Israelite army against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa as well. But this is where things seem to turn sour for David and head to the final saddest moment of his life. While marching along with the Philistines, on Samuel 29 it says the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish. They said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting." How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So King Achish sent him back to Ziklag. David's return to Ziklag after being rejected by the Philistines must have been a difficult experience. The Philistines didn't want him to fight alongside them against Israel because they didn't trust him. Israel's king, Saul, didn't want his services either, which must not have felt great either. David returned to his appointed town to find out an even worse thing, that everything he had and everything his soldiers had was taken, robbed, including their wives and children. Essentially, his career was over, his house was burned down, his wife and kids were gone, and so were all the people he was leading. 1 Samuel 30 says at this, David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. This was the moment David must have felt the most devastated in his life. It was unexplainable how his life and path had led him to this point, and it must have felt unjust to experience this. If one were to guess what he would do next is that he would pray to God saying, "But why, Lord? How can you do this to me? I don't understand." But he did not. What the Bible says he did next is, "But David found strength in the Lord his God." Despite this, David did not lose hope or faith in God. Instead, he sought God's guidance and strength in this difficult situation. It says, "Then David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?' That was his only question to the Lord. He just asked God, 'What's my next step?' He was looking forward. He was not dwelling on all his accumulated failures and disappointments in his last half of his life that falls short of what he was promised when he was a young shepherd. At 29 years old, David had known nothing but running, persecution, and insurmountable loss. His own most trusted soldiers, the 600 men who had been loyal to him for years, were now talking about stoning him. But his prayer was not to ask God for an explanation, but just a request of, what do you want me to do next? A sign of complete trust in the Lord, a trust that says he will make everything work for the good. And the Lord answered, pursue them, you will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. David and his men pursued the Amalekites who had taken their families and possessions, and they were able to recover everything that was taken. They also killed many of the Amalekites, and they brought back a great deal of plunder. This victory was a turning point in David's life. It showed him that God was still with him, even in his darkest moments. The beauty of this story is that it got darkest right before the sunrise for David. All his life had led to this moment of darkness where he lost everything. After this darkest hour, the sun indeed rose for David. A few days later, he found out King Saul and his sons were killed in battle against the Philistines. David received news of their deaths and mourned their loss. But then David finally took his rightful place as king, as the Lord had determined all along. Even David's decision to live among the Philistines was controversial, and some of his fellow Israelites criticized him for it. Nevertheless, David's stay with the Philistines allowed him to escape Saul's pursuit and gain valuable military experience that would later serve him well when he became king. Some historians even see a correlation that this might be the place where David's military learned the secret of smelting iron from the Philistines, as it was mentioned in previous chapters they were struggling to find weapons. Perhaps this might be one of the reasons why King David and the later kings had advanced military weapons afterwards. The Lord used his darkest days for training and prepare him to become the great king that we know today. The lesson of the story is that David chose to respond to his darkest hour with faith and hope rather than despair. He did not give in to self-pity or ask why God was allowing him to suffer. Instead, he looked forward and asked for guidance. He trusted that God would lead him through the darkness, and he was greatly rewarded for his faithfulness. David's story is a reminder that God is always with us, even in our darkest moments. When we turn to him in prayer, he will give us the strength and trust that he can turn any circumstance to our good.